Tonight we have Taryn Simon. Taryn doesn't actually know that I'm going to say this because she'd probably be mortified. And she's looking at me like, why are you doing this? But I first became really aware of her work in 2011, actually. I was in London for Frieze, and I went to Tate Modern, and they had a very large installation of her major work, A Living Man Declared Dead. And I was, sorry, thank you, Clara. And I was just fascinated by that work. And then one night during Frieze, we went to dinner. And at various, I swear this is true, at various tables, you know, there were a bunch of Germans, and you would hear them speaking in German, and then Taryn Simon would be mentioned. And then at the table next to me, there was this intense discussion about Taryn and her work, and I was like, okay, I really must know more about this artist and about her work. And that began my exploration of her work. So I'm thrilled that you're here. Thank you for coming. And I also want to thank, again, our friends at Hennessy Paradis Imperial. In fact, Mr. Hennessy, Maurice Hennessy, is here tonight, and we're really thrilled that he came over for this. So thank you. Oh, there you are. Thank you very much. So I think probably the best place to start in this discussion of Taryn's work is with a work that she created with a programmer named Aaron Schwartz called Image Atlas. And my colleague Kylie Lambert here is going to pull this up. And I want to ask you, Taryn, just to explain what is Image Atlas and what were you creating with it?
Image Atlas is a search engine that I created with Aaron Schwartz, and it is designed to look at the cultural differences and similarities between image search results from different search engines throughout the world. And in that, we were also thinking about the neutrality of the algorithms that govern the distribution of those images. And but mostly thinking about the possibility of a universal visual language. And as people were starting to communicate more and more through anything from emojis to images to abbreviated text, thinking about the disappearance of language, and if it didn't have an economic reason to be or for identity and communication, what would happen to it? And similarly, are the issues of translation that exist with the spoken or written word the same as the issues in translation with images?
Right. So I think maybe we begin with a couple of words that will demonstrate it. So let's try God and see what.
So you enter the search term in, and it translates it into all the languages throughout the world. And then you, in the Atlas selection, can select the countries you'll view the term translated in. And you can order it by GDP or alphabetically.
Right.
And so in God, you can see, obviously, the different versions that are primary in all of these different regions. Or there you see in Syria, it's Bashar al-Assad instead of
a deity.
religious icon.
Right, right.
Maybe try hunger. So in that one, you can also see just the collision of sort of a gluttony and actual desperation.
And these are ordered 1 through 6, and so number 1 is the top.
Yeah, and then
image.
you can click on individual images, and it takes you to the local website where they came from.
Right. Actually, I wanted to ask the audience if they had a couple ideas.
What happens when you put Me Too, hashtag Me Too?
See better from here. Well, North Korea, it's apparently an agreement.
Go back to China, which is
There it is.
so China. Oh,
Yeah,
that's
it's always interesting to see who represents things graphically versus through photography.
Do we have any other suggestions?
Oh, I've got one. What about Porsche? P-O-S-H.
Posh. 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 Huh. Well, so how does that happen? And if you look again, if you look at China, their definition of posh is that, interestingly.
Right.
Yeah.
And
All right. Well.
India architecture and anyway.
Right. So I think that begins to give you a sense of Taryn's work, because what is the thread through so much of what she does is the space between text and image, and that runs through everything that she does. So, my question is always like, is the image reality, or is it the text? And where does the truth lie? And do you even believe in a truth?
I don't think the work is positing a direct position where that truth inhabits, but it's more a reckoning with the process by which you can attain some semblance of truth. So, I mean, I think to find truth these days, it's like puncturing through something as difficult as the atmosphere. And truth is contingent and precarious, and
Yeah.
I don't know if it's of the body or language either.
So in some ways, in your work, it's it's the process of trying to understand what the truth is.
Yeah, or the labor required to construct knowledge.
Right. So when you began your work as an artist, the internet, I guess, was in its infancy, and now we're awash, in imagery every day, and I wonder how that has changed our perception of reality, and in this time of as fake news, as you kind of referenced, do we think about the truth in the same ways, and how does the image play into that?
I think there's this hyper accumulation of imagery right now, and obviously in many ways it's presenting sort of optimized or extremely vulnerable views of communities, nations, and individuals. And like when we're talking about achieving some sort of truth, when you think about well, first of all, I feel like that accumulation of imagery almost creates a digital skin where there's a third body happening, and but also photography itself, even the technological advancements and the advancements in lenses, which are allowing for such precise data and a collection of it to achieve a precision that the human eye can't even achieve. It's so surpassed that it actually, through all of that data, starts to become even more abstract or almost extraterrestrial or something. So
Right.
it gets unwieldy in its mass of data.
There's the Putin image, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a little bit of a step back. How did you become an artist? What led you to becoming an artist? Because you went into college thinking something different.
Yeah. I never consciously thought of being an artist. I didn't grow up around art in the way I think you're defining it. But my father and grandfather were both avid photographers, and my father, I grew up sort of learning about the world through his slideshows and seeing work he had made through the years of working with the government in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Thailand and Russia. And he would weave these really fantastical narratives as he presented these to me at a very early age and for many years thereafter. And I would always have to sort of discern what was the truth in all of that. And similarly, my grandfather, well, not similarly, conversely, he was a physicist, and he was interested in, he would photograph geological experiments, and he was interested in minerals and also astronomy and nebulas, but always with data being an accompanying component part of that. And so text and image, I feel like I'm very much in their path, but thinking more almost like an astrophotography or something, where it's taking this thing that is endless and compressing it to 2D and trying to take a constellation of something that's without end and making it somehow seem like you can comprehend it.
Well, but when you went to Brown, what did you intend to study originally?
Environmental science, yeah.
Right.
And I do feel like a lot of the
Right.
projects are sort of ecosystems in a way, where it's not just about the subject, it's about the bureaucratic limitations of getting to that subject. It's about the limitations and all the factors, again, a constellation that surround the idea.
Right. I mean, and when you know the backstory, it all makes sense that you would move from environmental studies to the study of systems, and it requires a great deal of research on your part, and the work is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. But when you're at Brown, how do you migrate from that sort of what you thought was your path of environmental science to really becoming a conceptual artist?
Semiotics.
Right.
Studied that as well.
Right.
If it
Okay.
doesn't crush you, you can then go on
Right.
to make
Right.
art.
So one of the other themes, I think, of your work is ritual, and you can see it again in the photography. But you recently moved, or at least I would define it as recently moved into performance. And there was one of your projects was called An Occupation of Loss, and it was at the Park Avenue Armory, and it was in 2016. And if you didn't see it, it was this kind of monumental study of public lamentation, basically. It was people grieving in public, professional mourners, actually, who were grieving in public. And it was this very obviously sonic experience, but also this kind of physically overwhelming experience. And I wanted to ask you kind of how you conceived of that, and what was your aim in that project?
Right. Well, I've always been interested in ritual and how it sort of organizes people or populations in moments of chaos. And in particular, in An Occupation of Loss, I was thinking about the complexity that opens up in extreme loss, whether it's physical death or mass tragedy or exile. And in that loss, there's a space that can be filled by militancy, orthodoxy, benevolence, but thinking about how different the ways in which we govern that potential and control it and limit the disruption to whatever the system is that's functioning in that moment. And I was also interested in that performance piece about just, is there any place left in us that is not programmed? Is there something that is actually individual, that is of you, that is a personal self? And thinking if that were anywhere, that it would be in loss, in grief, and that sort of unspeakable space of grief. And so I wanted to look at that and look at how even that was potentially scripted, but also authentic at the same time. Professional mourners, they navigate that really strange space, and then it's also completely unwieldy that we, in those extreme moments of grief, turn to strangers to guide us through it. So,
Right, the idea
the
of
use of ritual in that is
right. I mean, we don't really have professional mourners here in the U.S., do we?
no.
Right. Right. So that
Although
process.
you could say, it's also been replaced by media in many forms, and
Right.
the ways in which we're governed through moments of extreme loss.
Right.
are-
Right. For us, it's become more of a
It
Okay.
still is a collective experience that you're guided through,
right.
but
Right.
either religion or media.
I was going to say media, right? I mean, if you think about like mass shootings and the kind of ritual of thoughts and prayers after a mass shooting. So, but what drew you to performance, which is obviously very different from photography, or is it actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all my work that the medium is really decided after the process of research and the idea, and often it is photographic, but in this particular piece it was about, I mean, we were talking about text and image before. The act of mourning is something that's sonic and is beyond language in many ways. It's spontaneous. It's something where sometimes a professional mourner has to use the voice of a bird, or you need the presence of a raw egg and bread as you safeguard the soul's passage to the Milky Way, or there's Greek epirotic laments that bind the story of a life with its afterlife, or excavating uncried words. All these things are performed and spontaneous, so it had to be performance. It wouldn't function. It can't be captured in text or image, or at least in my mind it can't.
Right, but given the precision with which you work in terms of photography and text, does performance, is that scary?
Yeah, I mean, it confronts all my anxieties, because when I'm working with photography and text, there's spaces I can control. I can't control the interpretation of an audience, but they're fixed poles. With performance, it sort of fractures every time and morphs every time and is completely out of control.
Right. So you went to every performance, for example, in New York, right? And I guess in London too, where it was also performed earlier this year.
Stood in the dark pretending I could have some sort of,
Control.
yeah.
But there were differences, right, in each
Oh,
performance.
absolutely.
What? How so?
Just the movement of bodies through the space. The whole thing is responsive to the movement of the audience. The
Right.
sound is it's orchestrated by the movements and decisions of the audience. So no performance is the same.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the context actually also matters too, right?
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
So in London, when it was performed this year, it was in the midst of
Yeah.
something of a political scandal.
Yeah, it was the Windrush scandal that accompanied it there. And also, I mean, the work itself is very much about the movement of bodies across borders and the hierarchies in art and culture. The immigration process that we had to go through to get permission for the mourners to enter into each country with the UKVI Home Office or with USCIS. I mean, in America, we had to submit expert testimonials that were literally this high, a brick of paperwork.
On each performer?
No, in total.
Okay,
And
right.
that would be hard.
Sorry.
And then at the end of the performance, it's the only object that exists in the whole thing where you get a record of that process by which people entered into either the United States or the UK in the London performance.
Were there some people who were refused entry, or you couldn't get the documentation together?
Yeah, there were.
Right.
And I say it was curated by the governments
Right.
under which it's exhibited, because I have no control over the
Right.
performer list. And Yeah, I don't know what that would be today either here.
Yeah.
It's interesting to imagine.
Right, because the New York performance was done in 2016, so the process began obviously under the Obama administration, which was tough enough.
Right.
Do you think you could stage that same exhibition today?
It was almost impossible. I
Right.
can't imagine it being any more rigorous than what it was. But yeah, I would be interested to see what would happen today.
So another performance that's currently on view right now is at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, MassMoCA, and it's called A Cold Hole. And I'm sure they were thrilled when you did this. The museum, you've turned the museum into this perpetual winter, basically, where the floor is made of real snow, and there's a hole cut in the center, and then members of the public can plunge, and there have been examples of this in the slideshow, can plunge before an audience, which is watching from this large darkened room. So what was the impetus for that?
In that piece, I was really thinking about this idea of a quick fix. So, and how a personal reset and people desiring that, but imagining that it happens as quickly as a cold water plunge. And the idea of cold water plunge or cold water immersion also being this space that stops thought processes. You can't think in that degree of cold. And that intrigues me, this idea of a cessation of thought and one's desire for that and it accompanying a reset. And then I started looking into it historically. There's Geronimo used it to turn boys into warriors and prepare them for manhood and battle. And Darwin used it to cure illnesses. Vladimir Putin used it and distributed images of himself honoring the Eastern Orthodox tradition of Epiphany, reenacting Christ's baptism in the River Jordan. Instead of watching Trump's inauguration. It's the same day. And the gasp that's exerted when you dive into icy cold water is also only seen in birth and death and sleep arrhythmia. So trying to create that gasp of beginning and end for an audience and for an individual, and where sort of private intention and public ritual collide and also contrast.
Have you plunged?
Yes,
And
many times.
really?
Yes.
Okay. Is it different
Each time?
each time, or is
Yes.
it basically okay? All right. There's another work at MassMoCA which is called Assembled Audience, which I also think it's different, but touches on some of these similar themes. Talk about that one.
Assembled Audience is looking at the act of applause and thinking about applause and its history as a barometer of public opinion. And so that goes back to Roman times, where people would hire clacks or ringers to exaggerate appreciation at speeches, or there's obviously the amplification of Heil Hitler at the Nuremberg rallies, or artificial bots today manufacturing likes and appreciation, and just thinking about the social contagion of applause and why that happens and how that happens. So I chose to look at it in Columbus, Ohio, which is the nation's most accurate bellwether state, and every successful presidential candidate has passed through there and campaigned at one of its three major venues. There's 2 arenas and a convention center. So I centered on those sites in Columbus, which is also called Test City USA, because a lot of brands test their marketing strategies and their products in Columbus, because the demographic is considered to mirror that of the larger nation historically. So Kroger's, McDonald's, Starbucks, Abercrombie & Fitch, Victoria's Secret. And I wanted to look at all of the events that went on during a 1-year period in that city at those public arenas. And I isolated individual applause from every single event that occurred and then engineered my own audience of all these different ideologies. So you have someone from the Conference on Glass Problems alongside someone from a Republican rally, alongside someone from a Katy Perry concert, and create a new set of applause. And it's played over and over again, but no crowd is ever the same in the entire exhibition. Developed a program where it's constantly reassembled in different form.
Wow. So obviously a lot of research and the process of creating this work, I think, is something that we should talk about, because I think I mentioned before, the work itself is almost just this sort of tip of an iceberg. It's this, in some ways, not the smallest amount of the whole process, but there's this elaborate process of research and excavation that goes into what you do. So, one question I have is a fairly basic one, which is, how do these projects come about? They're one of your most recent ones, I think, it's enormous, is A Living Man Declared Dead. I'm sorry, I wanted to talk about paperwork and the will of capital,
Yeah.
which has been exhibited around the world. How did that come about?
That started with an image we just saw of, which sort of is similar to Orange, but it's an image of Mussolini, Hitler, and Chamberlain that I found, where they're sitting around a table with a big bouquet of white flowers between them at the Munich conference in 1938, and they are sort of designing the futures of populations geographically and economically, and nature is just there as this sort of decorative, dormant observer of their belief that they can actually control the evolution of the world. And so I sort of thought of the flowers as bearing witness and listening to them, and as the only other living organism in the room. And I then started looking at historic images of signings and contracts and decrees in which major decisions were being made, and saw this constant repetition of bouquets in all of those ceremonies. And I started recreating those bouquets. I limited myself to only exploring treaties where the signatories were the countries that authored the IMF and the World Bank at the Bretton Woods Conference. And I only worked from 68 forward. 68, obviously a very historical year, but also relevant for the introduction of Kodachrome and early murmurings of the internet, and thinking about media and distribution of image, and the way in which sort of the stagecraft of power is performed and maintained.
So the exhibit itself is recreations of the flower arrangements
Recreations of the flower arrangements
that you photographed?
sourced from the Aalsmeer Flower Market in the Netherlands, which is also the birthplace of capitalism. And then there's a whole other layer in it of creating impossible bouquets, which are bouquets where no flower could ever be with the other flowers in the same geographic region or season. And it's just a product of an availability now in a consumer society where you can have anything you want whenever you want. So I worked with a botanist to identify all the flowers and recreate these against the colors of the backdrops of the original signings.
And how long did that take?
Couple years.
Right. As I saw one version of it here in New York, and as I walked through it, I was thinking about just this idea of the permanence of a treaty, and this idea that this can define the world. Is that something that you think about in this work as well?
Right. Well, I mean, I do think a belief in survival is irrational in anything, in a way. And so the treaties that are part of the project, the 36 treaties, are all broken promises. And so one that's sort of relevant today would be the 1994 agreement between the UK, the US, Russia, and Ukraine, in which it was a memorandum on security assurances where Ukraine voluntarily turned over its nuclear stockpile to Russia in exchange for a promise to honor and protect its geographic integrity and economic integrity. And the US and the UK promised the same. That's 1994, cut to today.
Right. Right. Not so maintained.
No.
Right. There's also in Living Man Declared Dead that I mentioned earlier. That's a project I think that took also a few years, and you went to 20 countries. And again, that's this exploration of a system. In this case, a system of bloodlines. Why did that interest you?
That was an exploration of fate, really, and this idea of repeating narratives through time and looking at the ways in which our narratives are constructed by different forces, including chance, and sort of looking at those narratives and seeing where they are repeating and trying to determine some sort of purpose in it all. This accumulation of all our lives and stories, what is it actually mathematically doing? So that was it was a 4-year project.
And do you know when it's going to end? Do you see the end when, or is it, how do you know when you've finished?
Yeah. I've never not known when I'm done,
Right.
but I don't know it when I start.
Right.
But it's usually I'm exhausted, I've run out of funds, I have no energy left to give, it's done. And things also start repeating themselves, and certain patterns can, it's also maintaining a certain entropy in all of them, and it's just always been a clear marker for me.
Right. One of your projects is called A Polite Fiction, and it was a commission of the Louis Vuitton Museum in Paris, which is literally this excavation, and I wanted you to describe what that was about.
Right. Well, that was something I produced over a 5-year period in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, where Frank Gehry was constructing this building. And over that period of time, I collected all of the gestures and interventions that the workers, some of them who were just temporarily living there for the construction of the building, made that were later covered by the polished white walls of the building. And I collected things like poems written in all different languages, messages to aliens up in the skylight, photographs of world leaders pasted against walls. There was George Bush and Assad and Castro, and somebody left a cigarette for someone to have a future smoke. There were someone painted a beautiful oil painting in one of the galleries that was then covered up because he wanted to be able to say on his resume that he was in the collection of Bernard Arnault, because this was built for one of the wealthiest individuals and also owner of one of the largest luxury conglomerates. And another person wrote in the safe, there's more money here than in my entire country, Democratic Republic of Congo. So it was very much about these latent political, economic, and social forces literally pushing against power and privilege, but also silenced and not visible now, but not gone. They're all within those cavities.
So,
And,
sorry.
Oh no. Anyway, I also did I also documented the removal and disappearance of objects from the site over that period, and sort of an invisible marketplace that started to come about where people were selling copper wire on the black market, or taking a light strip for, one guy took a light strip for his son's aquarium, or, tile for a kitchen at home, and watching the movement of these goods.
And you track those down?
Yep. I actually got a lot of those goods. If they weren't already, like someone used concrete to build a wall, I couldn't get the concrete back.
Right.
But I did get a large number of those items back, and then they were put on exhibition
Right.
and photographed.
Right. Something else that I've often noticed about your work too, as I've studied it over the years, as you know, is this act of rejection, which is in some ways almost as important as the cooperation that you will get from, say, the U.S. government in photographing an explosion or being allowed into the customs facilities where you spent a week photographing everything that was seized by people bringing things into the United States. But the act of rejection itself, I think, is something that's interesting too, and something you acknowledge directly, which is why. Why do you do that?
I think rejection sort of points to like a scaffolding of control. And in those rejections, you can see that more clearly than anything that I would make. But I use them in A Living Man Declared Dead. There are empty portraits like these that are up there now. And I give the reason for the absence in those portraits. And many of those, that was about the family of Hans Frank, which was Hitler's personal legal advisor and Governor General of occupied Poland. And a lot of them didn't want to participate because of the narrative that I was highlighting, and others asked to be redacted so they were unrecognizable, and I give those reasons. In other countries in that project, there were absences there were women who couldn't be photographed for religious or cultural reasons, there were people in military service, but then there's also rejections like in An American Index of the Hidden and Unfamiliar, where Disney wouldn't let me into their underground facilities where the characters are out of costume and smoking cigarettes and the garbage is, and there's a holding cell and just the ugly innards of a city that are invisible up above. And someone wrote me a fax saying, during these violent times, it's important to give the public a fantasy they can escape to. And so I used that rejection.
And what year was
as
that?
part of the piece. That was 2007.
Right. So post 9/11,
Yep.
Iraq War. Right.
Yep.
Right.
And then more recently being not in the work, but where the work was literally physically rejected in traveling A Living Man Declared Dead to China. All of the text panels weren't granted entry. And so I had to exhibit it without the text panels, which is just kind of absurd. So I ended up painting black panels on the wall where the text panels would go, and at the time thought that was an interesting and maybe transgressive move, but that was coming from a very American position. I only realized after exhibiting it and looking at it more carefully that I was almost advertising this culture of careful margins and a control of speech. But also what became interesting in that was the ways in which you bypass those controls, because we ended up getting the text to everybody who came and saw the exhibition through an unpublished pamphlet of all of those texts. So everybody still got it.
Right.
It's just not in physical form.
And why did they reject some of those panels?
You don't get they don't give
explanation.
you a
Right.
reason.
Right. Right. So on the one hand, there's the work, and then on the other, there's the artist who creates the work. What's the separation between the two? Because you, for example, are never in your work yourself, or at least not physically or photographically in your work.
I don't know, it's interesting, even in this talk, when I have to talk about past projects, it's like I feel like I'm talking about 10 different people, the people who made those projects, and I feel like at the end of each one there's like a death of sorts, or that person is gone. And so, I don't know, there's sort of a very strange relationship that I have between myself and the work in these different times.
Right, right. But you also, you, for example, are not in your performance pieces, right?
No.
Right.
No, I mean, historically, I did put myself in my work quite a lot in the very beginning, and then I think I was very aware of the canon of women in art, and it often having this very diaristic approach or something about identity, and I think I consciously made a decision to not participate in that, which you could see as potentially inauthentic. But it's also, as you know, I've been doing this now for 20 years in a public space, and things have definitely shifted for women in art. So, and you sort of, I don't know if complete authenticity is something you can have when you're in something that is already, I don't know, insisting on a certain awareness
Right.
of issues. So.
So this is the Year Ahead conference. What's ahead for you?
I'm just starting another multi-year project, so I guess sort of harnessing the energy to do that.
Right. So in what, 3 years' time, we'll have you back to talk about that, right? Okay. You know, actually, there is one final question which I wanted to ask, which is, you know, if you think about some of the most recent work, you know, this occupation of loss, a cold hole, it's something about this idea of engaging the public, and it's happening in this kind of specifically community spot way, community space way, and I was just, which seems different from some of your earlier work, and I wanted to ask you about that before we go.
I mean, it's what interests me in performance. It's something where you can have a community or a public focused on one specific thing and forming a group around that, and it's not linked to a screen, and people aren't forced into seats. It's not suspending your habitual relationship with sight and sound as something like a movie does, and it. I think it reminds me sort of I was in the park the other day, and a hawk was flying above, and it kept swooping down again and again quite violently, and everybody in the park stopped looking at their phone, and everybody was centered on this hawk, and it was bizarre to be in a public space in New York and have hundreds of people all looking at one thing and having this sense of something happening, but again, not being forced away from a typical relationship with space and sound. So not involving the screen, and there's something kind of, I think, moving about that.
Right. Well, thank you, Taryn. I really appreciate you coming and sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thanks.